It's a pleasure to be here. So as Rowan said, I'm Esther and I work at the Climate Change Committee. So just in case anyone doesn't know, the Climate Change Committee is the independent advisory body to government on climate change. So we are funded by government to give them impartial advice on what needs to happen to reach net zero and to address emissions in the UK. We've been in existence since 2008, so we have advised governments of all shapes and colours, politicians from everywhere, left, right. Our role is not to be political. Our role is to present the science and the evidence and show what needs to happen in order to meet targets that we are legally committed to. So I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of kind of the national picture. So we've recently published a report called the Seventh Carbon Budget, which sets a level of emissions that the government has to stick to for the period between 2038 and 2042. We do this every 5 years. We set these legal targets that the government have to meet in terms of emissions reductions. But underpinning that, we do a lot of analysis across 14 sectors of the economy. And so I'm going to talk about the residential building sector, which is one of the biggest sectors and has quite a lot that needs to be done in order to get to net zero. So I'll start with this nice colourful chart because essentially this shows our emissions historically from about 2008 and then what actually needs to happen to get to zero emissions by 2050. So this purple line is what we call our balanced pathway, and that is the pathway that needs to happen in order to meet net zero emissions by 2050, coming down from where emissions are now. So you can see that historical emissions are a bit spiky. Probably unsurprisingly, residential emissions are very linked to temperature. So if it's colder, you'll turn your heating on more. So generally that spikiness is due to particularly cold or particularly warm winters. And then you come to here, and this is actually what needs to happen between now and 2050 to get us to net zero. And it's emissions reductions split into these chunks that are coming from different actions that households and councils and government are taking to reduce emissions. So you can see that the biggest chunk here, which I'll come into a bit more detail on in a minute, is from low carbon heating. So this is the switch from away from gas boilers and away from fossil fuel heating systems onto electric, more renewable, efficient technologies. We've also got a chunk here for new homes. So at the moment, a lot of new homes are being built with gas boilers and fossil fuels still, which feels a bit backwards. Feels like actually if we're building new homes, we should build them ready for net zero and ready for the future. Last year in 2024, 71% of new homes were built with a gas boiler. So it's not happening yet. And there's a lot that needs to be done there to ensure that it does happen. So that's from reducing the emissions and stopping building them with gas boilers. We've got a bit for household appliances, this dark line here. That's just things like your dishwasher and your washing machine and those being a bit more efficient. That bit kind of happens naturally. There are product standards in place that basically mean you can't sell really inefficient ones. So that is kind of quite a low effort way of getting some emissions reductions because you're just replacing your products as they run out anyway. You know, your washing machine breaks down, you get a new one, and that new one will probably be more efficient than the old one. Then you've got energy efficiency. So that's things like insulation in your home. So loft insulation, draft proofing, making sure you're keeping your home warm, and some measures to do that. And then we've got energy saving practices, which is kind of behavioral things. It's things like turning down the flow temperature on your boiler. It's using your heating more efficiently. So only turning it on at times when you're in the house, only having it on for a couple of hours in the evening, that kind of thing. And all of these things together make up a huge chunk of emissions. So currently at this point, residential buildings accounts for about 13% of emissions across the whole of the UK. So it's quite a big chunk. And the point we want to get to is where it's not contributing anything and it's actually net zero. Why do we want to do this? There are quite a lot of reasons, but I quite like this chart for showing it because it shows how our energy use changes from 2025 to 2050 based on the slide I just showed you. So actually making these changes, doing more energy efficiency, switching out your gas boiler for an electric system means that by 2050, we're using roughly a third of the energy that we're using now, which means we are more resilient. It means that you need less energy to heat your home. So in practice, if the right policies are in place, it should be cheaper as well. So you should get lower bills. But also it means we have to produce less energy and it means that we're more secure. And fundamentally, what we're looking at here in the yellow and red is fuels that will run out at some point. We've got a lot of gas now. We won't always have a lot of gas. We can always produce more electricity. There are lots of renewable ways of producing electricity. So this is a much more secure system that we're looking at in 2050. There are lots of positives for why we'd do this, but generally it should be a better system for all. But what this actually means in practice is quite complicated because it requires a lot of different players. So across the whole economy, about a third of the emissions reductions that we need to achieve by 2050 come from choices that individuals make. So about 2/3 is kind of government and the private sector. About a third is you guys and everyone else and me. Of that third, 3/4, so about 75%, is two things: is switching to an EV and getting a heat pump in your home. Those two things account for 75% of what you need to do by 2050. There are lots of other actions as well. There are things like using public transport more often, active travel. There's things like not flying all the time and reducing your meat and dairy intake. But actually, the really substantive bit of this is your housing and your car. So they are really critical switches that need to happen by 2050, but they're also quite critical things for the government to achieve its goals. So it is a kind of scenario where everyone can benefit, but there are also a lot of different barriers that are presented to individuals, but also to government, that need to be addressed to enable this to happen. So to talk about a bit of the policy landscape and kind of what this actually means in terms of what we need to do to get there, it's very critical to point out that the alternative technologies to gas boilers are very expensive. There's no way around that. They are expensive. But in particular, there's quite a big one-off cost in terms of switching over, because you need to switch over things like your radiators and you need to get a hot water tank, and those things are expensive in themselves. But actually, once you've got it there, next time you go to replace your heating system, it's much more straightforward. But that upfront cost is a really big barrier, because most people don't just have money lying around that they want to spend on a really expensive heating system. It's not the most exciting thing in the world. So there needs to be the right policy in place to A, make sure that people can afford to pay them up front, but also B, that they're not worse off after they've installed the system. So at the moment, we also have a problem where electricity is really expensive compared to gas. So electricity is about 4 times the unit cost of gas at the moment. And heat pumps are fantastic because they are very efficient. So heat pumps are the preferred electric technology because they're really efficient and they can reduce your energy use in general. They're only about 3 times as efficient as a gas boiler. So if electricity is 4 times as expensive, actually you could still end up paying more, even with that increased efficiency. So one of the most critical things, and it's not just the case on buildings, it's also the case across the economy, is actually bringing that cost of electricity down so that it becomes more competitive with gas, and actually it makes sense for people to make that switch. But yeah, so getting electricity prices down is a really critical part of this to enable these choices to be things that will save you money in the long term. But there's also quite a lot of other policy barriers and things going on here. Heat pumps are different to gas boilers, and actually there are planning rules around them and rules about where you can put them and how you can install them. And so that needs to be clear for local bodies to understand, but it also needs to be consistent and applied consistently. And that requires government coordinating that and making sure that the rules are really clear. There also needs to be some certainty in the market. Sorry, go on, yeah.
Why haven't you included solar panels in the electricity reducing carbon?
So we do include solar panels, but they get included. It's part of the way we do our analysis across the economy. They get included in our power generation section. So they are there. They're just not within our building sector.
Because it's reducing the energy. My brother has it, and it's creating heat from the batteries.
Oh,
so
yeah.
That's reducing the usage, and he's putting money back.
Yeah, exactly. Solar panels are fantastic, and they absolutely are part of the plan across the economy. It's just where we put them is a bit tricky, but we 100% think solar panels will be part of the solution. It's also partially about where you put them. So at the moment, there's quite a lot of work being done to put them on public sector buildings like schools and hospitals, because they're publicly owned and actually can generate electricity for communities. And the government needs to facilitate that as well. They have just launched a scheme that will be supporting doing that, but it needs to expand outwards so we can generate lots of that electricity. The government also needs to provide a bit of a framework for this. So it's a very big thing. There are 29 million homes in the UK. Nearly 90% of them are currently heated by gas boilers. We're talking about a huge shift change for people, and actually also for industry. We're moving away from a world where gas boilers are kind of the default. And without long-term certainty, you're not going to get industry to invest in it. They're not going to want to make that choice. You're not going to get private investment because they're not going to see the future of it. And you're not going to get people individually bought in because they aren't able to see where it fits in that landscape. So the government does need to provide some certainty that this is the direction of travel. And they have in some ways, but actually they need concrete policy there to do that. They also need to provide the certainty that the upfront costs, those big one-off costs at the beginning, aren't going to be a barrier. At the moment, the government do have a scheme that gives you £7,500 upfront towards those costs. But actually, for some people, that's not enough. And for other people, it's quite difficult to access. And there are still planning rules in place. And we don't know how long that funding will go on for. Currently, it's earmarked till 2028. But actually, we know that this is going to be a much longer process. So they need to provide some certainty there that there will be funding available to people to be able to make this choice. And they also need to make sure that it's being done fairly. So we know that there are issues in the UK with fuel poverty, particularly when we've seen the high energy prices in the last few years. And actually they need to ensure that there are ways for people who don't have the facilities or the income to be able to afford this to make that change. And so we need schemes like the Social Housing Fund, which at the moment provides funding to do this in social housing, like the Energy Company Obligation, which provides funding to do this in lower income households. And we also need some kinds of regulation to encourage people who naturally wouldn't want to do this to do it. So there's the whole private rental sector where we have landlords who aren't living in the homes and it doesn't affect them. And they're not paying the energy bills. And actually, they will delay making this change because it will be expensive for them unless they are encouraged to do so through regulation. So that's another, yes.
Sorry, do you have an average cost for putting a heat pump into a residence?
So under the boiler upgrade scheme, which is the scheme that provides that £7,500 grant, the average cost is about £13,000. So you're talking, kind of £5,500 more than the grant. A gas boiler installation all in all is usually about £3,500. So it's about £2,000 more than what you would be expecting to pay. Yeah. But I would also say that because the grant is £7,500, that average cost will be skewed to lower cost homes because the grant isn't enough to do the really big expensive homes. Sure. So I think in reality, you're looking probably more like £15,000 to £20,000 for most homes. But again, it's very property dependent. So what you're looking at for flats is quite different to what you're looking at for houses. You generally will look at a communal solution for flats, whereas you'll look at individual for housing. But also we have homes in the UK that are 200 years old that were built last year. There's a massive variation. So it is very dependent. And that's one of the complexities, is that what needs to happen does look a bit different. And so that's something where government does need to make the rules really clear and make it really easy to understand for those that have to implement them, be that councils or bigger local bodies. Basically, all of this is to say there are quite a lot of things that need to be done by government to facilitate this and to make it happen. When you look at it as an individual, it's quite scary. There's a lot of cost in there and it seems confusing. I think what I want to end on is that this isn't the first time we've done this as the UK. This has happened before. In the 1970s, about 11 million households in the UK, moved from something called town gas to natural gas in 6 months. It was done over the period of years, planning, but actually the switch happened very quickly and it was nationally coordinated and it did work. It was complicated, but it did work. So this isn't the first time we're asking people to make a big transition. It does happen, and we can do it, but we need to make sure that the right policies and the right support is in place to enable it to happen in a fair way, where the right people are paying for the right things and the right choices are happening in our communities. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.